Wouk may be one of the few people in the world who don't need an introduction. But let's start with what he says of himself. He's wholly a New York product. He went to Townsend Harris High School in the Bronx, then to Columbia University. There was a pretty big gap in his writing life after December 1941, and for the next 4 years. But on the other hand, much of what we know about the years 1941 to 1945, we know through him. He served on the USS Zane, a destroyer minesweeper, and also on the Southard. These ships became eventually the USS Caine, on which occurred an event that is now part of all of our educations. After the Caine Mutiny, which appeared in 1951, Herman Wouk turned his hand to other novels. Marjorie Morningstar, Youngblood Hawk, The Winds of War, and the tremendous television series War and Remembrance. And now there's The Will to Live On, a history of the connection between his own and past times. Herman Wouk has had many honors. A Pulitzer Prize, the play based on his work, the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial, translations of that work into every conceivable language, and a great presence in American life. It may be, though, that the greatest honors are yet to come. It's not bad to have had Humphrey Bogart, Henry Fonda, and Charlton Heston enact, as they have at various times, an event by him imagined. But first things first, his honor belongs to the English language. There's a great moment in the Caine Mutiny in which Willie Keith creates something he calls morale, smart, seaman-like appearance as an improver of, and he then posts it on the crew's bulletin board, stepping back in a proud agony of authorship and deciding he had a literary gift which could move men's souls. To which the narrator says, and he's right here to second the motion, this was optimistic. Herman Wouk understands the difference, and it would by no means be optimistic to assume that the language knows him. He came after the great modernists, and he learned how to use words simply and deeply. He wasted nothing. He filled the pages of his work with the unsolvable conflict of ideas and their statement. He gave us characters, Captain Queeg among them, who are going to be around for some time. He did something a lot harder than it looks, which is put an event almost unimaginably large and important into intelligible form. But the most important thing is he understands how to keep English up. Mr. Wouk?
Thank you, Ron.
Welcome here.
Beautiful.
Welcome aboard.
Thank you, Professor Berman, for that eloquent and possibly too generous introduction, which reminds me of a true story with which I'll begin. An old friend in New York, Larry Ween, one of you may have even known him here, a great philanthropist, gave millions of dollars to universities, Brandeis, Columbia, and as a result, received the usual honorary degrees that go with giving a lot of money. He received one particularly flowery citation at some university. He didn't tell me which one it was. And when he came home, he was reading it over, and he said to his wife, "Darling, I wonder how many really great men there are in the world." And she said, "One less than you think." I remember that whenever I hear one of these flowery introductions. I thought that was a stripped-down introduction, Professor Berman, and I thank you very much. Now I'm going to tell you another true story before I get into my fictions. That's a story about advancing age. When I was told that I was going to climb up on a platform here, a young lady said over the telephone, "Oh, we'll be able to assist you up." I said, "I think I can make it." But that's not unreasonable. I'm an octogenarian. Mrs. Wouk and I went to a summer place to cool off. We live in Palm Springs, where time goes very gently. The desert doesn't change much from day to day, even from season to season. And I'm not all that aware of age, but at this summer place, an old gentleman came up to me. We were leaning on a cane, actually, but hale and hearty enough, and he said, "You're a writer. I want to show you something that I once read. In fact, I copied it down and carried it around ever since. I don't remember where I got it, but here, look at it. Tell me if you don't think this is the way guys like you and I think about ourselves when we reach this age." And he gave me this sheet, and I started to read it, look at it. And he said, no, please read it out loud. I love the thing. I love to hear it. I said, "Well, sure, I'll read it." And I did. And here was what he handed me. "Now then, my jolly boys who are young and are old, who are foolish and are sensible, who gutted the years relentlessly and now number the days in wisdom, who desperately clasped girls and now fondly pat wives, open the closed books, wake the memories, sniff the dried roses of regret, and then let us fill a cup and drink with love to that most noble, ridiculous, laughable, sublime, departed figure in all our lives, the young man that was. Let us drink to his dreams, for they were rainbow-colored, to his appetites, for they were strong, to his blunders, for they were huge, to his beloved, for she was sweet, to his pain, for it was sharp, to his time, for it was brief, and to his end, for it was to become one of us, in the land where the bright sunlight fades not, where the flowers are spring flowers and the grass is an April green forever. He still walks his jaunty, infinitely mistaken way. God pity us all. With what precious coins have we bought our philosophy? Eh, my boys?" He said, "Well, you read that nicely." He said, "And don't you think that really does describe the way people like you and I feel when we get out of this age?" I said, "Well, modesty forbids me to comment. That's from my first novel, Aurora Dawn, and I wrote it when I was 29 years old." But Aurora Dawn, this first novel of mine, bears very directly on the theme of the evening. And the story of it is important. I'm deeply moved, of course, by this unexpected honor, the naming of the Herman Wouk Chair of Modern Jewish Studies. And I'm particularly moved and surprised because the fact is, I'm not regarded as an American Jewish writer exactly. I think Professor Berman will bear me out on that. There is a group of well-known Jewish writers, and there are books written about them, articles written about them. And it often happens that I don't appear in those discussions. Now, I make it perfectly clear I'm not complaining at all. I've been honored above my deserts from the critics and from the audience. Nevertheless, there is this curious fact that when you talk with Jewish writers, you don't particularly think of Herman Wouk, and there's a reason for it, and it starts with Aurora Dawn. Before the war, I was a gag man, joke writer, for Fred Allen. The one who had the feud with Jack Benny. I see there's a murmur of recognition here. He had this crack-a-barrel voice. He was a New Englander from way back. He hated California. His famous line was, "Well, California is a great place if you're an orange." I worked for him for 5 years very happily, and then, as Professor Berman described, I went to sea. I was a naval officer for 4 years, and out there for a lark, I started to write a novel, and that was Aurora Dawn. And it was just a lighthearted spoof about my experiences with the advertising business and working for Fred. It was published early in 1947, and here's the story of Aurora Dawn. There was a thing called the Book of the Month Club then. I don't know whether it still exists. But then it was very important. It was before Amazon.com. Even before paperbacks. And if you got a Book of the Month Club selection, you had a bestseller, and a considerable bestseller. Well, I never expected anything like that for my first novel. It was short, it was light. I'm proud of it. It was the first effort. I'm not ashamed of it. But it wasn't in that category. But here's what happened. William Faulkner wrote a novel, one of his later novels, and the Book of the Month Club, of course, selected it, and that was quite appropriate. But about a month or so before it was due to come out, the great Faulkner decided he wanted to revise his book a bit, and he took it back. The club was desperate, started to scramble around, looking for something to send their people, because it was the Book of the Month, you know. And somehow I said, well, there's this book, this light book, this Aurora Dawn, written by a fellow who used to write for Fred Allen. Let's use that. So Aurora Dawn became a Book of the Month Club selection, which meant that it was a considerable bestseller, which meant that the critics fell on it like a ton of bricks. But although it received good notices too, I mean, the book did well in a small, light way. But meantime, this was my debut, and first impressions are very important in personal relationships and in literature. And I made my debut with a successful book, which had nothing about Jews in it. And that was unusual, and I think that was the start of this anomaly in my career, which is my theme. And it's particularly anomalous because actually I was soaked in Yiddishkeit from my childhood. Maybe some of you have read one of my later works, Inside Outside, really a family novel and an autobiographical book. And I want to read a passage from it to indicate to you the kind of background I had, which was very different from what it seemed to be in Aurora Dawn. Inside Outside, as I say, is an autobiographical novel, rather complex. It's got a wraparound story about the Nixon White House. But this is just a passage about what happened to me when I was growing up. We start back when I'm about 6 with a $50. It fell on the open book as I sat with old Mr. Horowitz starting on my Bible studies. In the beginning, I was painfully translating, God created the heavens, thump, clink, roll. A big silver coin hit the page and bounced to the parlor floor. I was on it like a cat. From nowhere in midday, my father had appeared behind the Hebrew teacher's chair. An angel dropped that from heaven, Papa said, slightly smiling. Keep it and study hard. And he went back to his business. It's like the old thing of putting honey on the chumash, it licks up. But in the Golden, the Medina, money beat honey, hands down. Now, Mama had a different way of doing it. She's never had a light touch, my dear departed mother. Although she was terrific. A case in point about Mama's heavy touch is the incident of the window shade. It happened in the Kelly Street Synagogue on the eve of Simchas Torah, the rejoicing of the law. It was our merriest religious night of the year. It still is among the Frum-Ox, like me. The men marched with a Torah scroll 7 times around the synagogue, singing and dancing between the circuits. And we children paraded behind them, bearing paper flags. On the sticks of the flags, apples were impaled. And in the apples, candles were burning. I think some of you may even remember this. It was an unbelievable fire hazard. Since the Kelly Street Shul was just a wooden store, and the dancing, jostling children kept dropping burning candles all over the place. Now, I was quite content to march around with a flag and an apple and a flaming candle. Of course, I yearned for a velvet-mantled Torah, all aglitter with sequins, or at least for one of the smaller mantled scrolls that the Bar Mitzvah boys carried, Book of Ruth, Isaiah, Jeremiah. But I didn't rate that, not at the age of 6. Mama, however, had a great idea. The shul possessed one prophetic scroll for which nobody had as yet contributed a velvet mantle. The long, slender, rolled-up bare parchment was visible in the open Holy Ark, and Mama comes bustling out of the women's section and asks Pop, why couldn't he carry that thing around? It was a sacred book, too. Why can't you carry it? So my father got out the naked white scroll. Here, he said to me, without much enthusiasm, wouldn't you like to carry this? That, I exclaimed. Well, it's a window shade. No, he glanced over at Mama, back in the women's section, nodding and smiling eagerly at the curtain. And he said, take it, Yisroelka. It's just as good as a Torah. Well, he was my father, so I believed him. I fell in behind the last of the Bar Mitzvah boys who carried a mantled scroll, ahead of all the kids with flags, apples, and candles. Marching and singing for the next circuit began. Behind me, a child's voice, not mocking, just inquiring. Say, Davy, what are you doing with a window shade? Said over my shoulder, it's not a window shade. A synagogue crowds up on Simchas Torah. The congregants line up the aisle and the mothers hold their children up to kiss the scrolls as they go by. Mama, pipes up one of these tots when I'd hardly started out. Do I have to kiss the window shade? Of course not, said the mother, looking down in puzzlement at this little pudgy lunatic marching with this silly object. It's not a window shade, I said. It's just as good as a Torah. Go along, she said to me and to a child. Never mind the window shade. Well, so it went. Some jeered, some wondered, some whispered, some shook their heads in disbelief, but all along the line of march, there was unanimity on one point. I was carrying a window shade. Next, I was desperate to get rid of the thing. But how could I? It was holy, so I couldn't throw it down. Yet it was so ridiculous, no other child would take it off my hands. I tried, but they shrank from it. No. Even when the circuit was over, I still had to dance and dance and dance with that blasted bare scroll, the target of innumerable pitying or amused looks and pointing fingers. Is he crazy, that kid? Why a window shade? But Mama was clapping away in the women's section, beaming all around proudly with a look that proclaimed, look at my Davy, 6 years old and with a scroll already. Only she, of all the people in the synagogue, failed to see that like a clown whose heart is breaking, I was dancing before God with a window shade. Every author who acquires a name has what you might call a signature novel. I think Professor Berman would agree that Ernest Hemingway's signature novel is The Sun Also Rises. And Fitzgerald's is almost without doubt The Great Gatsby. And mine, of course, has been kind enough to mention is the Caine Mutiny. And that, too, bears on this theme that I'm delivering here of the strange, the strange fact that I really am not, or haven't been until recently, known as a Jewish writer. Caine Mutiny was published almost day and date with a really powerful, wonderful Army story called From Here to Eternity by James Jones. I'm sure many read it. A great movie was made of it. So it was a while catching on. But then it became, I can say so now after 50 years, a most tremendous bestseller. I mean, it's a once-in-a-lifetime sort of thing. And there, my wife and I were in the chips. So we took a transatlantic voyage, first class, Queen Mary. Doesn't exist any day. Luxury like that doesn't exist. And as I was walking along the deck, first class, I had the once-in-a-lifetime experience of seeing one person after another sitting in these deck chairs reading a Caine Mutiny. And there was one gentleman whom I recognized who was not reading the Caine Mutiny. In fact, he wasn't reading, he was sitting looking out to sea. I recognized him immediately. A wonderful, craggy face and a shock of iron gray hair. It was Sholem Asch, the great Yiddish novelist. Controversial because of his Christological trilogy, but, you know, an unmistakably great, one of the great authors of the day. Well, on impulse, I went up to him, and speaking Yiddish, which of course I could, I congratulated him on his work, and he accepted the compliment with gracious condescension. And then I mentioned that I just published a book called The Caine Mutiny. He stared at me. His eyes opened wide, almost popped out, and he said, "You're the author of The Caine Mutiny? I thought you must be a big blonde goy." And that evening we invited him to dinner, and he came to the very discreetly marked kosher section of Queen Mary. It was wonderful. It was just in among the others, but the silverware and the dishes were very discreetly marked with a Magen David. We were sitting at the table. The maitre d' led Sholem Asch to our table. He came to the table. He picked up the cutlery. He looked at a plate. And he said, "The author of the Caine Mutiny eats kosher, and Sholem Asch doesn't." But there you have it, you see. I don't know that most of the people who read the Caine Mutiny thought of me as a big blonde goy. But what the image that the debut of Aurora Dawn had created, the Caine Mutiny really fixed. I became known as a writer of large-scale war drama. In fact, when the Caine Mutiny was published, it said the Caine Mutiny, Herman Wouk, author of Aurora Dawn. And that fixed, I think, the image of Herman Wouk that lasted for years. Almost to the present day, really. And it's really strange because after the Caine Mutiny, I published Marjorie Morningstar, a wholly Jewish book, and also a very successful one I'm proud of. I wish I could read to you today, but time won't allow for it. And then, as many of you may know, I published a book called This Is My God, a nonfiction, a depiction of the Judaism I had learned and loved. But that didn't change it. And it's strange because I would think that Sholem Asch would have recognized in the Caine Mutiny, the key role played by a Jew, because Barney Greenwald, the Jewish lawyer who saves the executive officer and gets him acquitted at the court-martial, I hope that a lot of you have seen or remember the story. There's this Captain Quigg, who was a mad captain, or nearly mad one, who was relieved at the height of a typhoon by his executive officer. There's a court-martial, and this Jewish lawyer brilliantly turns around the trial so that it becomes a trial of Captain Quigg. The executive officer has relieved the captain at the instigation of the executive officer, a clever intellectual named Tom Kiefer. That's all you have to know, except this, to set the scene. This is the very last scene in the Caine Mutiny court-martial, and it's one of the last scenes in the book. Marek, the executive officer, has been acquitted. The novelist, Tom Kiefer, this clever intellectual who's been writing a novel out at sea, has just received an advance of $1,000 on his novel, and he's thrown a banquet to celebrate the acquittal of Marek and his getting an advance on his novel. And they invite Barney Greenwald to the banquet, and he arrives. And this is a speech that he delivers. $1,000 advance on a novel. Guess I ought to return the celebrated author's toast at that. A little speech. I'm very drunk, and I'm kind of warped. But it suddenly seems to me that if I wrote a war novel, I'd try to make a hero out of your captain, Old Yellowstain. And they all started laughing. No, I'm serious. I would. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you how I'm warped. I'm a Jew. I guess you all know that. I'd make Old Yellowstain a hero on account of my mother, a little gray-haired Jewish lady, fat. Well, sure, you guys all have mothers, but they don't have to be the same shape mine would have been if we lost this war. You see, the Germans aren't kidding about the Jews. They're cooking us down a soap over there. And somehow I can't cotton to the idea my mom melted down to a bar of soap. And you see, Mr. Kiefer, while I was studying law and you were working on your novel, and little Willie here was on a playing fields at Princeton, well, at that time, these birds we call regulars, these stuffy, stupid Prussians, they were standing guard on this fat, dumb, happy country of ours. Of course, they were doing it for dough, the way everybody does what they do. Question is, in the last analysis, what do you do for dough? You and me for dough, we're advancing our free little non-Prussian lives. So when all hell broke loose and the Germans started raining down a soap and figured, well, time to come over and melt down old Mrs. Greenwald. Who's going to stop them? Not our boy Barney. Can't stop the Nazis with a law book. So I dropped the law books and enlisted in the Navy to learn how to fly. Stout fella. Meantime, and it took 1.5 years before I was any good, was keeping Mama out of the soap dish. Tom Kiefer, Communications School. Willie Keith, Midshipman School. Old Yellowstain, maybe? Why, yes, even poor, sad Quigg. And most of them not sad at all, fellas. A lot of them sharper boys than any of us. Don't kid yourself. Can't be good in the Army and Navy unless you're damn good. Now, Steve, this dinner is a phony. You're guilty. Because you're only half guilty as another guy who stayed very neatly out of the picture. The guy who started the whole idea that Quigg was a dangerous paranoiac, who argued into it for half a year, who invented the name Old Yellowstain, kept feeding you those psychiatry books, pointed out Article 186, kept hammering it at you. He turns on Kiefer. If there's a guilty party at this table, it's you. If you hadn't filled Steve Marek's thick head with full of paranoia and Article 184, why, you'd have got Quigg to come north, or you'd have helped the poor bastard pull through the South. And the Caine wouldn't have been yanked out of action in the hottest part of the war. I'm all finished, Mr. Kiefer. I'm up to the toast. Here's to you. You bowled a perfect score. You went after Quigg, and you got him. You kept your own skirts all white and starchy. You'll publish your novel proving the Navy stinks, and you'll make $1 million, and you'll marry Hedy Lamarr, so you won't mind a little verbal reprimand from me. What does it mean? I defended Steve because I found out the wrong guy was on trial. Only way I could defend him was to murder Queeg for you. I'm sure that I was pushed into that spot. I'm ashamed of what I did, and that's why I'm drunk. Queeg deserved better at my hands. I owed him a favor, don't you see? He stopped Hermann Goering from washing his fat behind with my mother. So I'm not going to eat your dinner, Mr. Kiefer, or drink your wine, but simply make my toast and go. Here's to you, Mr. Caine's favorite author, and here's to your book. And he throws the wine in Kiefer's face. You can wipe for the rest of your life, mister. You'll never wipe off that yellow stain. He gives Marek a friendly punch on the shoulder. See you in Tokyo, you mutineer. He staggers out. Curtain. Thank you. Professor Berman, you'll be interested to know this, that when I finished writing the Caine Mutiny before it was published, I wrote a note in my diary. I've been keeping a journal for many years. And I wrote, this is not the war novel. I think it's a good story. I hope it'll be successful. But it's not the war novel I want to write. You see, when I was out at sea, I thought, like many young men must have thought, this huge war someday is going to be captured in a book. And though I'm just a lowly Fred Allen gag man, I can dream as well as the next man. And I would like to write that war book someday. And so when I just about reached the age of 50, I thought, well, this is it. Put up or shut up. Are you going to write that war book or aren't you? But my picture of the book had changed. I had thought of it primarily as a big Navy book because I was a naval officer with ramifications over in Europe. But meantime, and I'm talking about 20, 25 years of my life, the Holocaust gradually began to come out, and and the whole world began to understand what had happened. It never really registered on the world, and for that matter on me, until Ben-Gurion, bless his memory, sent the intelligence officers to Argentina to capture Eichmann and bring him back to trial. It was the Eichmann trial that made the Holocaust a world historical event. And I realized that, and was realizing down the years, that if I were going to write the war book, it would have to be a global war with at the heart of it the white-hot horror of the massacre of the European Jews. I realized that I was in for an enormous amount of research. I'd never been a historian. I hated history in college. It was my worst subject. I had to marry a Phi Beta Ki. She's sitting there now. So I made myself into a historian. 3 years of research on each book, 7 years in the writing. The central effort of my life, The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, and the 2 miniseries which I wrote. And I have to tell you this, it just happened today in the La Jolla Hotel. The bellboy was bringing me up and said, sir, what is your name? And I said, Herman Wouk. He went like that, and he said, I know that name. I said, the Caine Mutiny. Dead blank. The Winds of War. Oh, the Winds of War. Yes, yes, the Winds of War, War and Remembrance. I saw those. Oh, yes, my father raved about them. I think that's probably the way, if my work lasts, that may become my signature work. I'm not sure. In any case, it's the central effort of my life. Those of you who have read it or seen the shows know that the history hangs on the intersection of the lives of two families, a Gentile Henry family and the Jewish Jastrow family, bound together by a romance between one of the sons of Pug Henry and the niece of Aaron Jastrow. Jastrow is an apostate Jew, a very successful Yale historian, who's working in Europe when the war breaks. He and Natalie are caught, and little by little they go descend the seven hells of Nazi-held Europe and end in Theresienstadt. For years I thought of this book as Leyte Auschwitz, because the greatest naval battle, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the last train from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz happened at the same time, the latter part of October 1944. And all I can read to you from that immense panorama, all I can read and will read tonight, is the last entry that Aaron Jastrow makes in a book he writes during his experiences in Nazi Germany. You see, he rose to fame by writing a book called The Jew's Jesus. And this is called A Jew's Journey. And this is his last entry, written just before he gets on the train to go from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. I, Aaron Jastrow, the Jew, began this record of a journey aboard a vessel docked in Naples Harbor in December 1941. It was bound for Palestine. My niece and I left that vessel before it sailed and were interned in Siena. We escaped from fascist Italy through the help of the underground, intending to return to America via Portugal. Mischances and misjudgments brought us to Theresienstadt. Here I've seen German barbarism and duplicity with my own eyes, and have tried to record the truth in bold, hurried language. I've not recorded 1/1000th of the daily agony, brutality, and degradation I've witnessed. Yet Theresienstadt is a model ghetto. The accounts I've heard of what the Germans are doing in camps like Auschwitz exceed all human experience. Words break down as a means of describing them. So in writing what I've heard, I've put down the plainest possible words that come to mind. I'm going to my death. I've heard that strong young people are spared to work in Auschwitz, so my niece may survive. I'm in my 68th year, will not lack much of the biblical 70. Millions of Jews, I now believe, have already perished at German hands. Half or less than half their lives lived. More than 1 million of these must have been children. I was a man of nimble Talmudic wit, insight quick rather than profound. My parents took me from Poland to America. I expended my gifts there in pleasing the Gentiles. I became an apostate. I dropped my Jewishness, outside and inside. And above all, strove only to be like other people and to be successful and to be accepted. And in this I was successful. This period of my life stretched from my 16th year when I arrived in New York to my 66th year when I arrived in Theresienstadt. Here under the Germans, I resumed my Jewishness because they forced me to. I've been in Theresienstadt about a year. I value this year more than all my 51 years of Hefkerut, of being like the others. Degraded, hungry, oppressed, beaten, frightened. I have found myself, my God, and my self-respect here. I'm terribly afraid of dying. I'm bound to the ground by the tragedy of my people. But I experienced a strange, bitter happiness in Theresienstadt that I missed as an American professor and as a fashionable author in a Tuscan villa. I have been myself. I have taught bright-eyed, sharp-minded Jewish boys the Talmud. They are gone. I don't know whether one of them still lives, but the words of the Talmud lived on our lips and burned in our minds. I was born to carry that flame, but the world was greatly changed, and the change was too much for me until I came to Theresienstadt. Here I mastered the change and returned to myself. Now I will return to Auschwitz, where I studied in the yeshiva and where I abandoned the Talmud. And there the Jew's journey will end. I am ready. There's such a world still to write about Theresienstadt. And oh, if a good angel would but give me a year to tell my story from my early days. But these scattered notes, much more than anything else I've written, must serve as the mark over the emptiness that will be my grave. Earth, cover not their blood. Aaron Jasto, October 24th, 1944, Theresienstadt. And I'll tell you, Professor Berman, where I think this may have a better shot than the Caine Mutiny at being my signature. You all probably know who Alan Dershowitz is. Alan Dershowitz wrote The Vanishing American Jew and Chutzpah, Harvard law professor. He said to me, I met him backstage at a lecture. He said, I don't know what's the matter with the freshmen in law school these days. He says, I teach freshman law, trial tactics. And the instances I've always used are Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and the trial scenes in the Caine Mutiny court-martial. And he said, do you know, in this year's class, not one student had heard of the Caine Mutiny? He saw my face fall. He said, oh, don't worry, they haven't heard of Dostoevsky either. In the same way that I felt compelled to write about the war and the Holocaust, I felt compelled to write about Israel. And my two books, The Hope and the Glory, sweep through Israel's military history. I have time just to read for you an episode in the Six-Day War. The Hamtana, the waiting period, has been going on for 3 weeks. Colonel Nasser, the dictator of Egypt, has closed the Straits of Tehran, cutting off Israel's access to the sea, and has announced that the time has come to wipe out the Zionist entity once for all. So the reserves go out in the field and they arm, but the Europeans and the Americans tell them not to do anything, that they will persuade Colonel Nasser not to attack and to open up the Straits of Tehran. So they're sitting out in the field waiting 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And here we are out in the Sinai, waiting. A broad sandy plain at the Sinai and Gaza borders is shaking and rumbling as the diesels of General Tull's 300 tanks turn over in dawn warm-up. These obsolescent or second-hand tanks are a far cry from the advanced post-war Soviet tanks massed in Sinai. But these beefed-up old American and British tanks, smartened up by Israeli technology, are the best the Jews can field. Now, my hero, who's a sort of a flamboyant, very daring fighting man called Yossi Nitzan, and his nickname is Don Quixote, in Yiddish, in Hebrew, Don Quixote, is out there in the field. Don Quixote is scrambling eggs on a spirit stove under paling stars when his friend Lieutenant Colonel Elad comes bumping up in a jeep. Yossi, I want you to address my men. What about? What you told me last night. Will you tell them? I want them to hear it from you. Eat up and come along. The rising sun strikes Colonel Elad's crimson face as he confronts his battalion. Give close attention to Lieutenant General Nitzan. His loud voice drives the word over all the field noises. Kishot begins. 79th Battalion, we still don't know when or if we go to war. What we know is that the enemy is out there. Gestures toward the Sinai border, just a mile or so away. And that's why we've been out here for weeks, waiting, just waiting. I told your commander last night, and he's asked me to tell you, that only a European Jew like me can appreciate fully what it means to be an Israeli tank man. The young faces start to show some interest, most of them babyishly pink and smooth. Here and there a beard, and they're all topped with thick shocks of hair that stir in the breeze. You've heard the question over and over, Kishot says. Why did the Jews of Europe meekly wear those yellow stars, go into the trains like lambs to the slaughter? Why didn't they at least put up a fight? Well, I told Ehud last night about 3 cousins of mine in Warsaw, fellows just about your age, who wore those yellow stars and climbed up the train ramps without resisting. Why? Well, because first of all, the Germans lied to them, said they were being resettled in work camps. Was that so hard to believe? How could they believe, instead, that civilized Europeans, even if they were anti-Semites, actually were packing them into trains just to take them away and murder them? Well, now we know that was the horrible truth. But then, it was inconceivable. And now he has their attention, all of them staring at him. But even supposing they had suspected the truth, how could my cousins fight? With what? They had no weapons. They were European Jews. They relied on the Gentile authorities for law and order. And when a few Jews did find out the truth and took to the forests, or like the Warsaw Jews tried to fight back, it was all too late. Well, all I said to your commander last night was simply, thank God we're different. We're the Israeli Armor Force. He gestures at the rows of rumbling tanks. We've got these. We're trained to use them. We count on no government but our own government, our own Zion, our own tanks, ourselves. And that is why, but a distant hum makes him break off. The faces of the soldiers are turning to the sky. The far-off specks in the blue rapidly grow into planes, flying seaward in groups of 4. The motor noises rise to a drumming thunder. It seems to be beginning. With confused yells and cheers, the soldiers jump to their feet, waving arms and fists, as the planes fly by overhead, 4 by 4, glinting in the sun and casting fleeting shadows, flying so low that the blue Star of David shows clear on each fuselage. Nothing more to say, exclaims Kishot as the planes dwindle off, the motors fading. The rest is being written in the sky. Instead of the yellow star, the blue star. Am Yisrael Chai. Israel lives. Lieutenant Colonel Elad strides beside him. Attention! Rigid postures. Absolute quiet among the men. Their faces eager, cheerful, exultant. Crews to tanks. All personnel to battle stations. Maintain radio silence. Await orders. A sergeant jumps out in front of the battalion. Allez! From the battalion, a youth will bellow. Krav! Battle. Allez! Krav! Allez! Krav! 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 The soldiers disperse noisily at a run. Elad gives Yossi a bear hug and kisses him. Good, excellent, thanks. So here we go. Yes, be careful, Ehud. Definitely. We meet again in El Arish. Kishot, I love you. My last selection will be from my new book, The Will to Live On, which is my other nonfiction work. It takes the view of this is my God and looks at the scene which has been so utterly revolutionized by the Holocaust and Israel 40 years later. And with this, I will end my evening. Modern Jewish history takes a sharp turn in 1967. Only with the Six-Day War, 50 years after the Balfour Declaration, did there come the abrupt mass turn to Zionism. At that time, the threat to Israel by Egypt and Syria acting together and heavily armed by Russia with tanks, artillery, and combat aircraft wore the aspect of a second Holocaust. And the surprise triumph of Israel's armed forces, because Israel then only had 1 million people in '67, this surprise triumph against such odds created a mighty awakening in Jews all over the world, and especially in American Jews. The sudden outpouring of support, which some of you may well remember, financial, political, emotional, was unparalleled, unforeseen, and fantastic. But Jewish collegians today have no memories, as their elders do, of hanging sleepless on the news bulletins in 1967 and again in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, as Syria and Egypt attacked and for 3 harrowing days appeared to be crushing out the life of the new Jewish state. Of the earth-shaking glory of the Six-Day War, they know nothing but words and books, like my novel, The Hope, if they bother to read it, and more words of rabbis, parents, and lecturers. The Zionist few among the collegians who care about such matters not only encounter apathy, they risk being considered ultimate campus disgrace, uncool. Shortly after the Six-Day War, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol said to his ambassador returning to Washington, "You have a hard job now. You have to represent in Washington a nebbish Samson." Nebbish has made it into Webster's like other Yiddishisms. Nebbish, a timid, meek, ineffectual person. The whole present Jewish image problem is there in Eshkol's sardonic oxymoron. What sort of Jew lives among the nations today anyway? The nebbish eternal wanderer who docilely climbed into the German trains? Or the new Jew manning the formidable Israel Air Force and tank columns? Let me finally put my aspirations for American Jewish leadership in one visionary image. In some not too distant day, at their grand annual gatherings, they will be greeting each other, men and women alike, with the words, "What are you learning?" High on their yearly agendas will be reclaiming the heritage through learning, a sort of nationwide Manhattan Project, atomic bomb project of education on a scale unimaginable today, into which funds, money, and work will be pouring as they once poured into Israel in her years of peril. For the stark fact is that in the new century already upon us, we will be fighting against our own peril, a slow slump to oblivion. And yet, here in the United States, for all the scary attrition I have pictured, we're still a communion of over 5 million strong. That's more than the population of Norway. We live in the world's greatest nation, speaking the world language, and our material and intellectual resources are impressive. At a far stretch of my hopes, our descendants could one day be a diaspora comparable to Babylonia. At the moment, of course, that is beyond rational expectation. We have to concentrate on lasting at all. And the ultimate reason for that, to write down the unthinkable, is that if by some unforeseeable future horror, Israel goes down, we will be the last bastion of God's people on earth. American Jews can be aroused by its leaders to move mountains. But heart has to speak to heart. The Talmud says that in the world to come we are asked 3 questions. Did you buy and sell in good faith? Did you try to raise a family? Did you have a set time for Torah? Not, mind you, did you observe Shabbos? Did you keep kosher? Did you daven 3 times a day? The sages probably took such observance for granted. But in any case, they were delving to the bare rock of Jewish survival. Right conduct, children, and learning. Here are a few lines from the Talmud. Rish Lakish quoted Rebbe Yehuda, "The world is sustained only by the breath of children in the house of learning." Rav Papa objected. "What about you and me at our learning?" He replied, "Do not compare breath tainted by sin to the breath of the sinless." The leaders now, in their adult vigor, will serve their day and pass on. The octogenarian hand that moves this pen will have gone well before them. Our future lies with the children. The ember of Jewish identity whispers and smolders here in America. And if it is not to die here, it can only be blown into flame by the breath of Jewish children at their learning. I am overwhelmed by this honor that you have paid me. You've been a magnificent audience. Thank you very much, and good night.